Professor Raghav, thank you so much for speaking with Bloomberg Quint. This is an unusual year. There doesn't seem to be any pending economic crises that would dominate the conversation here in Davos. Do you think it's going to be a good, strong year of growth for the global economy?
Well, I think that's the central projection. I don't think there's any question about it. I think the IMF greatly upgraded its forecast, but that's after 9 years of downgrading their forecasts every year. And I think the baseline, we have lots of uncertainty, but the baselines, they'll keep upgrading their forecasts for a while. There are lots of risks. One of them's coming to visit Davos in a day or two. China, perhaps if global interest rates rise faster than people are expecting. But I think the shadow of the financial crisis is finally melting away, and that helps. That there are other factors.
Do you believe that global interest rates could potentially rise faster than anyone expected?
My baseline is no.
Yeah.
But I have more uncertainty about it than I think the markets do. I don't think anyone really knows why they went down so fast, went down so far. And how can we be sure they won't go back up? I would bet at some point in the next few years, interest rates will be significantly higher than are currently priced in the market. But we may not see that in 2018.
Well, as yet, it doesn't seem to be that inflation has given anyone a reason to worry, especially in developed economies.
No, that's right. But eventually, it will kick in. I mean, I think there was more slack in employment than we realized. And so it wasn't, and probably the fact that labor share has been declining also is a factor. But it'll turn. I mean, you have accelerating growth, you have unemployment being really low, and now a fiscal stimulus. I predict inflation will rise above 2% in the U.S. this year.
What role will the dollar play in this? Because it's been most confusing to try and read the currency.
Well, I think what's been happening with the dollar of late is that the big growth story the last year is not the United States, it's Europe. And Japan's done better than expected. And even some emerging markets, Brazil, Russia, which were in deep recessions, are not so much in recessions now. So it's not that the U.S. is doing badly, but we've seen a recovery in the rest of the world. And I think that's the story with the dollar. And of course, yes, interest rates are going to come up in the U.S., but eventually they're going to come up in Europe. I don't know about Japan, but they're going to come up in Europe a little sooner than people are expecting. Probably not this year.
The U.S. seems to be the big growth focus, for the last few months, especially ever since the tax reform went through. And do you think that could have a big impact on growth rates in the U.S. this year or next, equally then the impact on the dollar?
So just the corporate tax, let's just speak about that, because the individual tax makes no sense to me.
Okay.
Let's just talk about the corporate tax. The corporate tax was a good structural reform, except they set the rate too low. So they took a messy system, produced something much cleaner and more elegant. That aspect should be being praised, but they set the rate down to 21%. It's so low, it's going to lose a lot of money. I think the growth effects are going to come out in the future because it rationalizes expenditure. The tax bill actually shifts money away from housing into industry, into more productive things. But it's funny, the IMF predictions, just the opposite. They had a very large number, if I read it right, of how much, over 1% per year, that it's going to add both 2018 and 2019. And then they said it's going to be lower because of the debt. I think it was a good thing, but not because of stimulus, but because of structural reform.
One reading I saw of it or heard of it was also that it seems to favor small industry in America, and that could have a dramatic impact on the way small industry succeeds over the next few years. Is that your key takeaway as well of the tax reform impact?
Boy, I didn't understand that. I didn't see the corporate tax cut as necessarily favoring, smaller industries over larger ones.
Okay.
Apple seems to be benefiting very nicely. That's why stock prices.
We already saw a large number of companies return $1,000 each to employees.
There are a lot of industries that are not incorporated, so and they're not benefiting from this, so-called S corporations and other things.
You see this impacting because you study global fund flows closely as well. Do you see this impacting global fund flows because it now makes it maybe more easier or less expensive to move back funds that global corporations, American corporations had parked overseas?
So a lot of this is bookkeeping. the money's not actually moving, never moving. It's just moving from where you do some accounting. So I think there's much ado about nothing in some of this. But the good thing is this long-term effect of having, instead of having a hodgepodge of corporate tax rates, the average was probably 25%. But the official rate was 35%. You know a lot of this in India, I'm sure.
Yes.
But now they've made it much simpler. It's cleaner. It's more uniform. And that's a good thing.
And you don't think that this will mean that American companies will invest less in other countries in the world and more in the U.S.?
No, I mean, I think that if you look at the global growth story, there's still going to be reasons to invest elsewhere. The fact is, the last year, the surprising growth was not in the U.S., which did probably a little worse than some people expected, but in places like Europe. Of course, Macron is coming and saying, what about France? You know, we're not so bad. Please invest here.
Yeah, well, we're going to see much of that through the course of this week because every day there is a global leader here speaking. But before I get to that, I think, a quick question on what you think of what's happening with the, equity markets in the U.S. and across the world. I've heard some comments on whether they seem overvalued in bubble territory, and no one's been able to tell whether it's time to call the top or not. Do you have a view on what's going on with stock markets across the world?
I really don't see a clear case for overvaluation or undervaluation. But what surprises me is the volatility. The biggest risk is really, again, that interest rates rise faster than anyone expects. Doesn't seem to be priced in at all. The volatility indices are at phenomenal lows. But the level of the stock market, I mean, interest rates are so low. Where do you put your money? That's a big driving factor. But if interest rates rise, the stock market could easily fall. If interest rates rise much faster than expected, we could see the stock market 20% down. And I think Donald Trump will be pretty upset about that.
We have a new Fed chief this year. Should we expect any surprises from Mr. Powell?
I think not in the short run. The way these transitions work are the new Fed chair says, I'm just a clone of the old Fed chair. Everything's going to be the same. And it's only after 6 months, a year, that differences take shape. And I think, after all, Jay Powell learned a lot from Janet Yellen. He worked with her very closely. The Fed was shrinking under Trump because no one was getting appointed to the board. I think there were just 3 people working at one point. They spent all their time together. And he's not an economist by training, but I think he learned a lot. That said, when you get faced with new challenges, it could be different. The thing that worries me the most is that U.S. inflation does start rising, but the stock market falls, and the Federal Reserve wants to raise interest rates, and suddenly Trump is tweeting about it in the middle of the night. That's a serious risk, an institutional risk. And I think one of the reasons investors here are so complacent, they're so calm, is that, well, he's leaving the Federal Reserve alone. The appointments are pretty reasonable, and they are pretty reasonable to the Fed, and he's respecting their independence. But the interest rates are really low. Why shouldn't he? And that worries me a little bit.
Okay. I want to talk about what you made of Prime Minister Modi's speech yesterday, and then, of course, we will hear from President Trump on Friday and what you hope to hear from him. But let's start off with Narendra Modi first.
Well, I mean, I like the message that the world should be open to globalization. I wondered a little bit if the message was directed at home as much as the rest of the world. India is growing faster. It's time for us to think of ourselves in a more global way. No, I think he's done a lot of interesting things. I don't know how easy it's going to be for him as the election gets closer to continue to do new policies. But I hope he's able to. But there have been a lot of dramatic changes in India, as you know.
And then it will be about Trump on Friday.
Yeah, what's so unpredictable about Trump is they may write a speech which his daughter Ivanka looks at and says, this is great. You're, saying globalization's good. It just should be a little different. Let's just make it a little fairer. And, that's totally reasonable. And yet then he just says something completely off script. That's all anyone covers. It's very, very unpredictable. But I believe the main reason he's coming is actually to beat his chest that the market's up, the global economy is doing well, and he'll say it's me. You've got to thank me. You may not like me, but you should thank me for what I'm doing. And of course, You know, I mean, I think the main reasons the market are up and the main reasons the economy are doing well are these very slow-moving factors, not anything he's done. Because after all, his big bill, it just got passed.
Yeah.
So how could that be the explanation? But who knows? I couldn't read his mind.
So this is going to be then a calm year. There isn't any, outside of what you've expressed in terms of a concern about inflation coming in maybe faster than you anticipated or interest rates rising faster. It is hopefully going to be...
Well, slow down. I gave you a baseline that I think growth estimates will go up. But I'm not going to tell you it's going to be a calm year. There are risks. So China's obviously a risk. I'm sure I said that to you last year.
And the year before that.
And the year before that, and probably the year before that. Things that are unsustainable eventually have problems. And that's maybe tied with President Trump, you know, the number one risk to the global economy, and interest rates rising. Of course, there could be a geopolitical event. I tend to think when the worst thing I can think of are a geopolitical event, it's saying things are pretty good, because usually a geopolitical event's only really bad if the economy is very fragile to start with. So I could imagine a very large equity drop after a geopolitical event, but at least in my studies of financial crises, they tend not to be so dangerous as debt crises.
Okay. So my key takeaway then, if I'm correct, Professor Rogoff, is that you're saying that Trump is the biggest risk to the global economy this year.
I had him tied with China. It's just something irrational coming from that.
Trump
I think
China.
you just have to put him on the list.
Okay, fine.
Because we just don't know what he might tweet in the middle of the night.
We're going to use that as our headline. Trump and China, the key risks to an otherwise complacent global economy.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Rogoff, for your time here in Davos.